Welcome to The Power to Create, a web series helping you refine your creative vision by looking at the fusion of technology and inspiration. If you've been curious about high dynamic range photography, you're in luck. In today's episode, we'll walk you through the gear you need and the major techniques used to create stunning photographs. Hi, this is Rich Harrington for The Power to Create, and I am here at Great Falls, Virginia, which is along the Potomac River. You can hear it roaring behind me. It's a cold winter day, but a perfect day to shoot some high dynamic range photography. We're out here today with a friend and colleague, Abba Shapiro. He's a photographer himself, as well as a Drobo user. First off, it's winter time. Skies kind of overcast, not a lot of detail. It's not a dramatic sunset. This is the middle of the day. Most people would go, oh, well, if you're going to be shooting a landscape, it's got to be really early in the morning or right at sunset. What's HDR going to do for us today?
Well, what we don't see a lot of times when we shoot a picture is dynamic sky. And even though if you look at the sky, it may look a little bit bland, when we actually pull out the detail in that sky, because we can shoot high dynamic range, we'll see the detail in the sky and also the shadows. And you know, it could even snow today. So who would think of shooting on a day when it snows? But you can get some of the best high dynamic stuff actually if it does start snowing.
Now, one of the things that's going to be tricky that makes HDR a bit tough is normally you shoot a totally static subject. Of course, when we're shooting things like water, it gets a little bit difficult because with the water itself, there's a lot of motion. Now, Abba, what sort of gear do we have out here for shooting HDR? You and I are both set up in a similar way.
We have different cameras. We have Nikons and Canons.
Yep.
I'm using the 5D Mark III, which has built-in HDR capability and also the ability to bracket. And bracketing is something we're going to talk about, so you can actually shoot that dynamic range of the really bright highlights and still get detail, and the shadows and still get detail.
And I've got a D600. Now, recommend highly that you use a solid tripod. You can shoot HDR with that one, but you're gonna have to go the garbage pod mount, the trash pod. You're gonna have to find a flat surface and really hold that camera down. And we're both using cable releases. Now, Abba, why the cable release?
Well, I'm a big fan of really sharp images. And even the little bit of motion you might have when you press the shutter release could shake the camera. So if you want something that's tack sharp, using a cable release or using a remote shutter release really does help.
All right, so let's go ahead and get shooting, and we're gonna walk you through the process as we're doing it.
So the first rule you should think about when doing anything in high dynamic range, shoot raw. Never shoot JPEG if you're going to be doing high dynamic range. You want as much dynamic range to start with initially with each image. Now, a high dynamic range image says I'm going to take the brightest part, I'm going to expose for the middle part, and I'm going to expose for the darkest part. And then I'm going to merge all those images together. Built into the Mark III is the ability, if I wanted to shoot high dynamic range with simply a press of a button. So I can simply go in and I can switch over to a high dynamic range or an HDR setting. When I select that, I'll simply enable that, and I'll have a choice once that's enabled to either have the camera automatically determine how many stops brighter or darker, or I can actually select 1, 2, or 3 stops between the brightest, the standard, and the darkest image. And now all I have to do is take my picture. I'm going to go ahead and set my shutter speed and let it work with the aperture. And the reason I want to control shutter speed is I have a choice. Do I want to freeze the water, or do I want it to really flow? Do I want long exposures? Right now I want to freeze the water. So I'll bring the shutter speed up to, say, 1/500th of a second, and my standard ISO is going to be 100, and then 3.5 for my aperture, and it's going to open and close that down 2 stops. I snapped the picture, it snapped 3 images, and actually now it's processing it in camera to give me an HDR image. But I'm also saving the 3 original images if I want to take it into post-production, in which case I might be using either Nik software or Adobe Photoshop. Now, once the processing is done, I can simply press on the back. I can see in my histogram I have a nice balance. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here. And what we can see with the high dynamic range is I get a darker image, a lighter image, and a standard image, and then it blends them all together, so I actually get brighter and darker stuff. Now, You may not have a camera that can actually do HDR within the body of the camera, but that won't stop you from shooting HDR imagery.
So I'm all set up with the Nikon D600. Nikon has built-in HDR capability as well, but in this case, it's going to depend on style of shooting. A lot of times that built-in HDR only works when shooting JPEG. Personally, I'm of the school of thought that I want the maximum flexibility, and I'm going to do that in post when I'm in a nice warm studio with total control in a color-calibrated environment. All right, let's walk you through the basic setup. First off, I've put the camera on continuous high. I'm a big fan that when I fire that shot, I want it to go through those brackets as quickly as possible. Generally speaking, once I set my focus, I'll turn off autofocus. Also, since I'm on the tripod, I've turned off the vibration reduction. I don't need any sort of image stabilization. So I'm going into the bracketing order here, and it depends on how you want to shoot. Now, I prefer to shoot the under, followed by the base exposure, followed by the highlights. I just find that a lot easier when I'm browsing in my application like Adobe Bridge or Lightroom to locate my images, but that's totally up to you. In this case, I'm shooting 3 shots. That's what this camera can pull off. In a lot of cases, a 3-shot HDR is perfectly fine.
With the Mark III, I can actually bracket either 3, 2, 5, or 7 shots. 7 shots will give me a lot of latitude, but it might be overkill, and I want to go ahead and we'll do just 3 shots because a lot of your cameras may only have the ability to bracket 1 lighter and 1 darker. So now what I'm going to do is when I set up my camera, I can actually choose how much I want to bracket. If you notice, it's centered right there, but if I wanted to, I'm going to turn the control on top of the camera and say how many stops I want between my first shot, second shot, and third shot.
I'm currently at an f10 aperture here. That's going to work well for me. I want to have good depth of field. I want things to still be pretty much in focus, but later on, I'll actually change that as well. Varying your f-stop is a good trick when shooting HDR because you might decide you really want that deep depth of field, and that's also going to give you better control over how much light gets into the camera.
One last thing I like to do when I'm shooting high dynamic range is being able to control how open or closed my aperture is. If I wanted to really get fluid water, to get that kind of like flowing water, not freeze it, what I need to do is I need to keep my aperture open. But in a day like today, I'm going to get way too much light in. So what I have right here is a neutral density filter. And basically, it's just a dark filter that blocks light. So now I can open up my aperture, less light's going to come in, and I can have really long exposures. And I really like that idea. You can get neutral density filters that just cut out 1 or 2 stops, and some that may cut out 9, 10 stops.
I've got it all set up here that I'm going to be using my auto white balance. That's okay. I may actually shift that here to deal with the clouds. Doesn't really matter because I'm shooting raw. All of that can be easily changed during post-production. I'm going to go ahead and use my remote and fire that off. And one of the things I like to do is actually call up the histograms. The benefit of seeing the histograms is you can clearly tell what sort of shots you've got. So I see my highlights there, definitely spiking, but doing a great job of bringing out that water. As I go to the midtones there, lots of information and shadows, so I'm very happy. Now, with a day like today, I've got a lot of haze in the sky. I've got a really bright subject. Taking advantage of exposure compensation could be useful. Now, I am shooting in aperture priority mode, so this makes shooting the bracketing easier, and shooting aperture priority is going to give me exposure compensation. So let's just call that up, and I'm going to take that down about 1.3. And this is also a good time. I'm going to go up to f20 for shooting. And let's use this as an opportunity to do a 3-stop bracket. So I got 3 exposures, and I'm going to push that out to a 3-stop bracket. Looks good. Fire away. I'm much happier there using exposure compensation with that 3-stop bracket. My highlights are peaking there at the end of the HDR. It is a raw file, so I got lots of latitude for recovery. As I go over to the midtone, lots of information right there, smack in the middle of the histogram. And my shadows, really dark, but it's giving me good flexibility. All right, Abba, I'm really curious to see what you got in the shots that I got. But actually, before we do that, what do we need to do with our images first?
We need to back them up.
Right. And so this is one of the big things that I'm a big proponent of, is making sure that you've got multiple backups. You and I both have Drobo Minis.
Absolutely.
What do you like about it?
Well, I like the fact that I have really a backup of my backup, and it's high speed, because when it's this cold outside, I don't want to stand outside and wait for it slowly to get off the card.
Yeah.
I like the fact it's a high-speed backup. I used to have to carry multiple hard drives. Now in one fell swoop, I can get it backed up, I'm comfortable, and I can get back into a nice, warm car.
Yes, so actually that's what we're going to do, the backup. I'm going to head to the car and I'm going to start to back up my images. Pretty cool stuff, and I'd like to thank Drobo for sponsoring the show.